In 1985, the Colombian town of Armero was completely wiped off the map in one of the deadliest volcanic disasters in history. When the Nevado del Ruiz volcano erupted, it triggered a massive mudflow that buried the town under meters of volcanic debris, mud, and water, killing more than 23,000 people almost instantly. Scientists had predicted the eruption and warned authorities weeks in advance, but evacuation orders were never properly enforced. When the mudflow hit, it moved so fast and forcefully that most residents were unable to escape in time. One of the most haunting images from the disaster was Omaira Sanchez, a 13-year-old girl who was trapped in the mud and debris for nearly 3 days, while rescuers were unable to free her. Despite her dire condition, she remained remarkably composed, speaking to journalists and comforting those around her before tragically passing away on live television. In 2019, airport workers at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris found a body lodged in the landing gear of an Air France plane that had just arrived from Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. Stowaways hiding in airplane landing gear is an extremely dangerous and often fatal attempt to travel, as the compartments are not pressurized and can reach temperatures as low as -60 degrees Fahrenheit at cruising altitude. Lack of oxygen and freezing conditions typically lead to hypothermia or asphyxiation long before the plane lands. Despite the extreme risks, cases like this have occurred multiple times, with only a handful of survivors in recorded history. In 2005, workers cleaning an abandoned subway tunnel in New York City found a perfectly preserved body wedged between the pipes and cables. The remains, later identified as John Patrick Adabo Jr., had been missing for nearly 25 years. Strangely, his body had not decomposed in the usual way. Due to the dry, warm air and constant airflow in the tunnel, he had undergone natural mummification, leaving his skin leathery and intact despite the passage of time. Investigators determined that Adabo had likely wandered into the tunnels in the 1980s and somehow became trapped, unable to find his way out. Because of the remote location, no one had noticed his disappearance, until maintenance workers stumbled upon the site decades later. In 1999, Nicholas White, an office worker in New York City, became trapped alone for 41 hours inside an elevator. Late one Friday night, White stepped into an empty elevator in the McGraw-Hill building, expecting a quick ride. Moments later, the elevator suddenly stopped between floors, leaving him completely stranded with no phone, no food, and no way to call for help. Security cameras captured his increasing distress as he paced, sat, lay down, and even tried prying the doors open. No one noticed he was missing for nearly 2 days. When the elevator was finally checked, White was found exhausted and dehydrated but physically unharmed. The experience left him deeply traumatized, and he later sued the building's management. In 1994, a teenager named David Hahn from Michigan attempted something incredibly dangerous, building a working nuclear reactor in his backyard shed. Fascinated by nuclear energy, Hahn, who was just 17 years old, collected radioactive materials from smoke detectors, old clocks, and lantern mantles, slowly amassing enough radioactive isotopes to create a makeshift breeder reactor. He even wore homemade protective gear while handling hazardous substances, completely unaware of the extreme health and environmental risks. Eventually, his backyard reactor started emitting dangerous levels of radiation, prompting a federal investigation. The EPA, FBI, and Nuclear Regulatory Commission were called in, and authorities declared his shed a radioactive hazard zone. It had to be demolished and buried as nuclear waste. Although Hahn survived the incident, he later suffered from long-term health complications believed to be linked to radiation exposure. In 2014, a French woman named Danielle Lair was found alive but severely weakened after being trapped in her own bathtub for nearly 3 years. Danielle, a retired woman living alone in Saint-Amand-Montrond, France, had slipped while bathing and became wedged in a way that prevented her from escaping. With no family or close friends regularly checking on her, she remained stuck in the tub, surviving only on small amounts of water from the faucet and whatever she could reach within her limited space. Her apartment was in a quiet residential area, and since she had no social connections nearby, no one noticed her absence. Eventually, neighbors began to question why her mail had been piling up for years and called authorities. When emergency responders entered the home, they discovered Danielle still alive in the tub, severely malnourished and barely able to move. Miraculously, she survived the ordeal but required extensive medical treatment to regain strength. In 1966, two men were found under strange circumstances on a hillside near Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. They were both wearing waterproof coats and unusual lead masks covering their eyes, with no clear signs of what had happened to them. Near their bodies, investigators found a notebook with cryptic instructions, including references to an unknown meeting time and taking capsules. However, no cause of their passing was ever confirmed. There were no visible injuries or signs of struggle. Some theories suggest they may have been involved in an unusual scientific experiment. Dr. Richard Heen, a former professor, was an obsessive book hoarder, amassing thousands of books in his tiny apartment. Over the years, his collection grew into unstable stacks, creating a maze of paper and hardcovers. Neighbors often joked that his apartment looked more like a library than a home. One night, as he attempted to retrieve a book from one of his precariously stacked piles, the entire structure collapsed on top of him, burying him under hundreds of volumes. Because he was a recluse, his body wasn't discovered for days, only when neighbors reported a strange smell coming from his apartment. In 2015, a 32-year-old landscaper named Luis Guillermo from Arizona was stung more than 14,000 times by a swarm of Africanized killer bees. Guillermo was working near a hollowed-out tree, unaware that it contained a massive hive of aggressive, Africanized bees, a species known for their highly defensive behavior. When the bees felt disturbed, they attacked in full force, covering his entire body and stinging him thousands of times. Despite attempts to escape, the attack was too overwhelming. Emergency responders counted over 14,000 stingers embedded in his skin. Even after being rushed to the hospital, the sheer amount of venom in his system caused multiple organ failure, leading to his tragic death. Africanized bees, often called killer bees, were originally bred as an experiment in Brazil but escaped into the wild, spreading across the Americas. In 1955, the MV Joyita, a merchant vessel, set sail from Samoa to the Tokelau Islands on what was supposed to be a routine journey. But weeks later, the ship was discovered adrift in the Pacific Ocean, with no sign of its 25 passengers and crew. The ship was still floating, despite being partially submerged, and the cargo and lifeboats were missing. The radio was tuned to a distress frequency, but no messages had been received. Personal belongings, medical supplies, and navigational equipment were all left behind, but the people had completely vanished. Investigators found no signs of violence or struggle, leaving their fate a complete mystery. Some believe it was piracy, others suspect a mutiny, while some even suggest paranormal forces were at play. To this day, not a single trace of the missing passengers or crew has ever been found. During the 17th century, Europe was devastated by repeated outbreaks of the bubonic plague, leading to the rise of one of history's most terrifying medical figures, the plague doctor. Plague doctors wore long dark robes, leather gloves, and wide-brimmed hats, but their most iconic and unsettling feature was the beaked mask. The beak was filled with aromatic herbs, spices, and vinegar-soaked cloth, which doctors believed would protect them from miasma, or poisoned air, thought to spread the disease. While the costumes were meant for protection, they often terrified the very people they were trying to help. Many saw the arrival of a plague doctor as a death omen, as their presence meant the plague had already reached the area. Ironically, these doctors had little success in curing the plague. Their treatments, including bloodletting, applying leeches, and fumigating homes with smoke, did little to stop the spread. The thick waxed fabric of their robes, which may have unknowingly helped prevent flea bites, the actual cause of the plague. In 1955, a man known as Romulus Riggs, Romy Parsons III, was found dead inside his iron lung, a massive machine designed to help polio patients breathe. Romy had contracted polio as a child, leaving him almost completely paralyzed and dependent on the iron lung for survival. For years, he lived in a carefully controlled environment, unable to move freely but still communicating with visitors. Then one morning, his caregivers discovered him lifeless inside the machine, even though there was no apparent malfunction. Strangely, the iron lung was still operating when he was found, meaning his death was not caused by mechanical failure. Autopsies revealed no clear cause, leading some to speculate whether it was due to a sudden medical condition, an unnoticed machine flaw, or even something more mysterious.